Very good morning to all the dignitaries and dear students present here. A very warm welcome to you all on this platform. Myself, Mridul Shrivastava, all my life I have read, taught, and administered law as a subject. After enjoying each day of my 32 years of old illustrious career at University of Rajasthan, I joined Manipal University, Jaipur to establish School of Law at Manipal Group of Institutions. And now, Honorable Vice Chancellor Dr. Dev Swaroop has entrusted me to establish law programs at Ambedkar Law University, Jaipur. On behalf of Ambedkar Law University, it is my proud privilege to introduce a renowned legal luminary who carries aura of visionary, who, as an outstanding statesman and academician, has shown immense contribution towards changing the legal education. It is not here, but the legal education landscape of the country, I must say. A well-known figure in the legal education domain globally. Prior to his stint in NLU Bhopal, he was the Vice Chancellor of Ambedkar Law University, Chennai. He has also served as the President of CLAT Consortium. His gamut of work encompasses constitutional law, administrative law, human rights law, election law, and refugee law, etc. He focused on building research capacity. As he says, today's students are far better than because they have information in advance and they don't depend on books. So he has always stressed on the research work of the students. He has more than 47 articles to his credit in national and international journals. Professor Vijay Kumar is the recipient of many awards, including the Best Vice Chancellor Award. I would like to take this opportunity to share with you all how fondly our Honorable Vice Chancellor Dr. Dev Swaroop often mentions Professor Vijay Kumar's name with great pride and dignity. We are honored to have your gracious presence, sir, with us. We have with us a person of fusion of many qualities, a leader, an administrator, and an academician who always strives for the welfare of students and staff, a man who has encouraged, motivated, and inspired all of us. Our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Dev Swaroop, is here to bless us. I'm sure as a founder Vice Chancellor, he will set up high standards and quality education. We are fortunate to have your leadership, sir. May I request Honorable Vice Chancellor Dr. Dev Swaroop to please say a few words.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you very much, Mridulji, for saying many good words about me. But yes, this is the occasion to welcome and recognize the scholarship, the command, the role played by none other than Professor Vijay Kumarji. I know him for a long time. His contribution in maintaining and raising the standards in legal education is immense. I still remember his role played in various committees of UGC, his observations, his arguments, his suggestions. I think he's a man of incredible credibility and, uh, something beyond description kind of credentials. So this is an honor for me to welcome Professor Vijay Kumarji. And I would like to say that he was so gracious, so kind, that when I requested him to kindly address our students, our teachers, other dignitaries on this occasion, especially on Dr. Baba Saheb's birth anniversary, he was very graciously said that, yes, I would like to speak on the contribution of Dr. Ambedkar as chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution. The great work of Dr. Ambedkar, besides as a social reformer, as an activist, as a social leader, his contribution in formulating and framing the Constitution is immense, we all know. And especially for the scholars of law, students, teachers, and all those who are interested. And I think everybody should be interested to know more and more about the Constitution, its formulation, the observations made by various dignitaries, and how a balancing act was made by none other than Baba Sahib Dr. Bhim Rao Ambedkar. It is more significant because our university is also on the name of that great visionary personality, Dr. Baba Sahib. And one commonality between this university and Professor Vijay Kumarji is that he is also former Vice Chancellor of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, Tamil Nadu Law University. And the university's nature is also similar. Our university is also affiliating university, and that university is affiliating university. As we all know that this is the third affiliating university in the country, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and then Rajasthan, and fourth is underway, that is Odisha. So, sir, at this juncture, there are certain limitations that we are not able to welcome you physically here, but we really and sincerely welcome you, and would be an honor to have you here some other occasion physically in due course once the situation becomes normal. Sir, we have started our LLM program, 1 year program, as a residential activity of the university with 40 students. And besides that, the university has the endeavor to have the affiliation of law colleges of the state of Rajasthan other than the constant departments of other universities. So 80 plus law colleges are there in the entire state, and these colleges are in the process of affiliation with our university. The university has had various meetings of academic board and board of management and academic council, and have formulated the uniform syllabus also for all these students and academic programs being undertaken by these colleges. And while formulating and revising these syllabuses, the latest legislations and legislatory provisions have also been added. So the university is committed, as the vision of the Honorable Visionary Chief Minister of Rajasthan, Ashok Gehlot ji, the vision is to improve the academic standards of legal education in the state of Rajasthan. So we are committed for that, and association, interventions, suggestions, and uh, playing role in any capacity by such eminent scholars like you adds our credentials and our position here in the state. So on this occasion, I welcome all the participants. I'm just a great occasion for me. I have been listening Vijay Kumar ji on various occasions. तरुण अरोड़ा जी हैं, प्रियंका सैनी जी हैं, राज पुरोहित जी हैं, यहाँ पर मैं देख रहा हूँ सबको, और हमारे आरती अनेजा हैं, अंजू गहलोत हैं, ये सब लोग अपने जाने पहचाने नेम हैं. So I welcome you, and I'm immensely grateful. Once again, I would like to say that I'm really and really immensely grateful to Vijay Kumar ji for sparing this most valuable time and addressing all of us. So with this, Mridul ji, I request you to kindly take it forward.
Yes, sir.
And at the end, you must convey my gratitude to Vijay Kumar ji,
Yes, sir.
and I will talk after that, right? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. May we now have Professor Vijay Kumarji to share his views on today's very, very important topic, Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar's contribution as chairman of the drafting committee of Constitution. Please, sir, may we have you?
Right. Dr. Dev Swarup, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Bhimrao Dr. Ambedkar Law University, Jaipur, the Registrar of this university, Dr. Mridul Srivastava, the principals of various colleges, deans, students, invitees, ladies and gentlemen. A very good morning to everyone present here. Today we are remembering Dr. Ambedkar on his birth anniversary, and it is very apt to speak a few words of wisdom that he had shared before becoming the chairman of the drafting committee, after becoming the chairman of the drafting committee, and also his role in the first interim government between 1947 and 1952. It will require at least a week's deliberation to elaborately mention about the contributions made by Dr. Ambedkar, particularly in the making of the Constitution. And I don't think we have that type of time available to us. And therefore, when Dr. Dev Swarup asked me, I said I'll certainly do, but I will not be covering every aspect. I'll restrict my interactions because it's about law colleges and the law university in Rajasthan. So it will be much more interesting for us to look at least 4 or 5 important themes on which he has wonderful contributions. He has cautioned the framers of the Constitution and what is the present situation here and there. I'll just make such examples to make particularly the students of this university to appreciate the wisdom that he had and how we have moved away from that words of wisdom from Dr. Ambedkar. I do not want to get into the history of where he was born and when he was born, what were his achievements as a student. I don't want to get into. I think that is a normal thing everyone will do. He has got so many degrees, he has got the first PhD, so on and so forth. I will not delve into those aspects. I would like to just get into the aspect as to how he became the chairman of the drafting committee in the first instance. As all of you know, that the Constituent Assembly had begun its deliberations on 9th December 1946. When it began the discussion, Dr. Ambedkar was not the chairman of the drafting committee. He was only an ordinary member of that assembly. However, few weeks before independence, the grant of independence, that is prior to 15th August 1947, during July 1947, that is a few weeks, maybe 3 weeks before independence was granted to us, Jawaharlal Nehru met Mahatma Gandhi to seek approval to utilize the services of Ivor Jennings. I want everyone to remember this. It's very, very important for us to understand. So Jawaharlal Nehru met Gandhi few weeks before independence, and his intention was to finalize and utilize the services of the constitutional expert, Professor Ivor Jennings, for finalizing the draft constitution. Now, it is an agony. We were trying to get the independence from the British, and in the drafting of the constitution, the leader then wanted Professor Ivor Jennings to be involved deeply in finalizing the draft constitution. It involves 2 things, because the constitution was already drafted, and that was the role given to Dr. Rao, Benagal Narasimha Rao, who assembled materials from various aspects and drafted the first draft, and he was ready with that draft. And the Constituent Assembly was to go through each and every provision, discuss, accept, reject, modify, do whatever they wanted to. And in this enterprise, Nehru wanted Sir Ivor Jennings. Ivor Jennings is not an ordinary person, right? He was a doyen, he was a tall figure in the field of constitutional law, but everything was rooted to what you call it as the British constitution practice. And therefore, when he went and met Mahatma Gandhi, asking that Ivor Jennings be involved in the finalizing of the draft, Gandhi very promptly, very strongly and staunchly disallowed that and turned down the proposal by saying, and I want you to please observe the statement of Mahatma Gandhi at that particular point of time. When we are sending the foreigners away, why a foreigner again? He had no disrespect to Ivergenics. His notion was, when we are sending the foreigners away, why do you want to have a foreigner in this venture? Right? He asked Nehru to enlist the help of Dr. Ambedkar for finalizing the draft constitution and also make him independent India's first law minister. Right? See the vehemence in the statement of Mahatma Gandhi. He never disrespected Ivergenics. At the same time, he never wanted a foreigner to be at the helm of the finalization of the draft of the Indian Constitution. And therefore, very clearly, he said no to that and directed Jawaharlal Nehru to, because Nehru was yet to become the Prime Minister, because it was only after independence he became the Prime Minister. So at that point of time, Nehru had to take the popular image of Mahatma Gandhi at that particular point of time, who was instrumental in the freedom struggle to a great extent. And therefore, though Nehru resisted this proposal from Mahatma Gandhi, he was left with no option, right? And accepted the advice of Mahatma Gandhi. And that is how Dr. Ambedkar became the chairperson of the drafting committee. And incidentally, he also became the first law minister in 1947. Now, many people who are appreciating the Indian Constitution today, reading the Indian Constitution today, would know how this parliamentary form of government, the cabinet form of government, the ministerial form of government, prime ministerial form of government, in whatever language you call, that was not accepted as a form of government in India. But during the deliberations in the Constituent Assembly, many members said that we have lived in the British parliamentary regime for more than 200 years, at least from 1859 onwards. And therefore, we are familiar with the British constitutional system. And therefore, they all wanted the parliamentary form of government of the British origin. I'll come to that little later. But you can understand that Nehru was directed by Gandhi to make two observations. One is to appoint Dr. Ambedkar as the chairman of the drafting committee to finalize the draft constitution. And number two, to make him the first law minister. And I need to make a mention to you at this juncture, Dr. Ambedkar was not a member of the Congress party. And then you will be surprised that when the first cabinet was constituted in 1947, after independence was given, there were 5 ministers, right? There were 5 ministers out of 14 cabinet ministers appointed by Nehru, and 5 of them were not even members of the Congress party. They were members belonging to different groups, different political parties, or without any affiliation. But they were all what we call it as not only gems and diamonds, but they were the experts in the field. Dr. Ambedkar was not a member of the Congress party, was an expert in law. Similarly, there was some Chettiar from Tamil Nadu who was wonderful in his area on finance. So he became the finance minister. So like that, there were about 5 members who had become the ministers in the first cabinet formed by Jawaharlal Nehru, and they were not even members of the Congress party. Right? Today, you just look at the center or at the states and ask this question, how many opposition members or non-party members are included in the cabinet or in the ministry? And that speaks volumes of our parliamentary form of government, which has, I think, over a period of 70 years, possibly taken the wrong route as against the written provisions of the Indian Constitution, right? And then Once he was appointed, right, as the chairman of the drafting committee and the first law minister, right, uh, on 30th August 1947, Dr. Ambedkar took over as the chairman of the drafting committee, and during which many of the previous drafts were taken into consideration, examined and re-examined, reshaped and finalized in the context in which the constitution was adopted on 26th November 1949, right? And it is a long journey. The Constituent Assembly met for 2 years, 11 months and 17 days, right? There were many deliberations, many discussions, which many people contributed to the present, not the present, for the adoption of the constitution, because the present constitution is tampering of that original constitution of 1950 almost 104 times. And therefore, we need to be very careful in understanding what was adopted, what is it today, and what are the deviations that continue to exist even today as against the written words of the constitution. I'll make, I will not get into the details of each and every aspect of the Constitution, but I would like to, as I mentioned to you earlier, I would speak around 4 or 5 important themes on which Dr. Ambedkar's contributions were immense, in my opinion. Not that the other things were not important, but I consider that these were more important and particularly more relevant as on 14th April 2021. And that's the reason I'm choosing these 4 or 5 topics. If time permits, I'll touch upon the 5th one. Otherwise, I'll stop with the 4th. And that's why I'm using 4 or 5. Don't mistake that I'm not certain. I'm certain. But depending upon the time that is allotted, I will just either stop with 4 or 5 if time is allowed. The first area on which I would like to mention the immense contribution made by Dr. Ambedkar is on the concept of federalism. Now, all of us understand that it took almost 43 years. Please carefully listen to me. It took almost 43 years for the Supreme Court to come to the conclusion in S.R. Bommai versus Union of India that yes, of course, our constitution is federal in nature, right? When? After 43 years. And up to 43 years, we never functioned as a federal state at all, maybe for some times, right? But on many occasions, it remained as a unitary state, but that was required in the initial stages when we got independence and we had to assemble, say, around 600 odd princely states with the British, provinces and other, princes coming together and create one single unit. It was not an easy task. Uniting them is one, and keeping them together was another. And therefore, the concept of federalism, which we have understood, is far from what Dr. Ambedkar mentioned at during the Constituent Assembly debates, right? I would like to make a few observations made by him in the Constituent Assembly. I want all the young students to carefully listen to me in this regard. Dr. Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly very clearly declared the Indian Constitution is a federal constitution in as much as it established what may be called a dual polity, which will consist of the union at the center and the states at the periphery, each endowed with sovereign powers to be exercised in the field assigned to them respectively by the Constitution. The words were crystal clear. Each and every word that is said in the Constituent Assembly was more than a declaration. I really do not know whether to appreciate the Supreme Court, which in S.R. Bommai's case said yes, federalism is a basic structure, right? And why the Supreme Court did not intervene in state of Rajasthan versus Union of India when 9 state legislative assemblies were dissolved together. What happened to the concept of federalism at that particular point of time? Right? We don't have the answers. Now we want to discuss the past aspects in such dissection that we may miss the bus. And therefore, right from the beginning, even before 26th November 1949, a categorical declaration by Dr. Ambedkar saying that the Indian Constitution is a federal constitution, right? I think it took 43 years for us to understand. What is the reason? The reason is that we followed many of the books written by authors, and therefore, if you just take any book and then read what type of government we have, I think even in civil services examination, if a multiple choice question is asked, what type of government we have in India, if you say it is presidential, you will fail. But if we say that we have parliamentary form of government, possibly you will get that mark, right? But the fact remains that it is not so. If you ask this question again, whether Indian Constitution reflects federal or unitary, right? Possibly if you answer that it is federal, you may not get the mark. If you say it is unitary, you will get more marks, right? This I think probably because of the books that we have been following, we have been reading, including the book written by Sirvai, right? I used to teach this. I am a student of constitutional law for over almost 40 years, right? And I have read the constitutional provisions in greater detail, and I have conducted many of the academic staff college programs in detail, compelling the students and the teachers to go through the written provisions carefully so that we can understand and say that even a judgment delivered by the Supreme Court can go wrong if you don't read the provisions of the Constitution carefully. And therefore, the draft Constitution prepared by the Assembly under the wise leadership of Dr. Ambedkar provided for the distribution of power between the center and the states. Between the center and the states. And let me tell you, our distribution was much more unique in the federal arrangement, because when you look at the American Constitution, the powers of the Congress have been very neatly, deliberately put in Article 1, Section 8. 18 different subject matters have been enumerated. Rest of them were given to the states. So the residuary went to the states. And some other constitution followed little later. They specified the center power, the power of the states, and they also created a concurrent power. But Indian Constitution went one step further. It is not 3-level distribution, but it is a 4-level distribution. What are they? In the first place, if you refer to Articles 246 or 245 to 256, read with the 7th schedule to the Indian Constitution, you would see how beautifully it was articulated by Dr. Ambedkar in whatever is said, right? That Indian Constitution is federal in nature. And they contributed, the Assembly contributed immensely under his leadership in the 4-fold classification of the distribution of powers. The first one is that the powers of the center, the parliament, to make laws given under 97 entries of list 1 of the 7th schedule, 66 entries in list 2 for the states, and then there is also something called as concurrent power, right? As if these 3 lists are not complete, if you carefully read Article 248 and entry 97, there is something, the 4th one, that is called as residuary power, right? Whatever is not mentioned in any of these 3 lists, entry 1 to 96 and list 2 and list 3, Article 248 read with article entry 97 of list 1 creates the residuary power, whatever is not mentioned and whatever new areas are emerging, and those areas will be left with the center, right? This made many of the Western writers to look at the Indian Constitution, including Professor Ivor Jennings, to call that Indian Constitution is not purely federal, it is unitary, right, in nature, having some federal features here and there, right? So because they lived under the British Constitution, which still continues to be a unitary constitution, so they do not want to think something different in saying that Indian constitution is federal in nature, right? Now, many people also observed, right? The federal constitution of India will remain federal in the normal circumstances, right? And the regional governments are each within a sphere. Please carefully listen to me. The regional governments, that is the provincial governments or the state governments that we call today, are each within a sphere of coordinate and independent. Coordinate and independent, not subservient. Coordinate and independent, and not subordinate to each other. Neither the central government is subordinate to the states, nor the state governments are subordinate to the center. These are all the practices which have overtaken the written provisions today for what you call it as the party organizations. Now, I want to just flag this issue for your consideration because in the US, there are two political parties, right? But two political parties, there may be the third one, the fourth one, maybe we don't know, but two are very prominent, the Democrats and the Republican. And let me tell you, there is no federal Democratic Party. There is Democratic Party and Republican Party at the state level. That's all. There ends the matter. There is no boss at the national level to sit and decide who will become the chief minister of the states, right? And therefore subjugating the states under its belt. Therefore, the language used by Dr. Ambedkar, which requires our attention more than ever before today, because it says the regional governments are each within a sphere of coordinate and independent and not subordinate to each other, I think is the words of wisdom which we have failed to realize even after 70 years. This is, I do not want to name who is responsible for this, but the fact remains that for whatever is the reason, political, economic, or our neighbors, whatever is the reason, things have gone from one end, one objective identified by the Constituent Assembly to something entirely different, right? And then somebody asked this question: if that is the case, if Indian Constitution is federal in nature, why did you use the term that India, Article 1, India, that is Bharat, shall be union of states? The word union is used. Union focuses more on unitary feature of the Constitution, for which very clearly he did not rejected the arguments and referred to the Canadian Constitution, where they also use the term union in the Constitution rather than federal in the writing of the Constitution. And therefore, the term union instead of federation was intended to connote a higher degree of integration. See the language, a higher degree of integration. And he was absolutely right. He was absolutely marvelous. I was also going through some of the important developments as a teacher of comparative constitutional law. I would like to bring, because many people say, why many people? The learned judges of the Supreme Court have said a number of decisions that ours is not a federal constitution like that of the US, right? And I would like to just remind you the preamble of the US Constitution, right? And I will not even go through the entire preamble, but the first part of the preamble, which says, we the people of the United States of America, in order to make a more perfect union, right? In order to make a more perfect union. And it doesn't mean union is unitary. And that is our misunderstanding or misquoting of the term union. And that is what Dr. Ambedkar said very neatly. It is a higher degree of integration. And that higher degree of integration was more required in India at that particular point of time when independence was granted and the constitution was being drafted. And before the first general election took place, everything needs to be aligned in this particular manner, right? And therefore, Dr. Ambedkar eulogized the term Union of the States on the plea that it indicated two important facts. They are, number one, federalism in India has not been the result of an agreement among the units, right? Like the American Constitution, it was not an agreement of the states coming together. 13 states came together, right? It is not an agreement in that sense. And the second one is that the constituent units of the Indian Federation had no right to secede away from the Indian Union. And therefore, if you look at the language of Article 1, India, that is Bharat, shall be a union of states. See, if people don't understand whether they are lawyers or judges or politicians, they have to at least read the Constitution any number of times. Shall be union of states. Now, union is not a unitary state, because what follows thereafter is union of states. So even assuming that the power given to the parliament, they can play with the territories of the states, combine two or more states. Ultimately, there shall be at least two states, isn't it? So Indian Union cannot be purely unitary in nature. There will be two roles played by the central government called as union government and the states, and this has not been properly identified or promoted consciously for whatever was the reason in the last 70 years. And therefore, when we say federalism, we need to understand the language much more better. And therefore, my fear today is that even today, whether really the federalism makes any sense, my feeling is the answer is no. Why? The power to make a policy choice on many important issues are not even with the union government or the state governments anymore. I'll give you a couple of examples. You take the environmental issues, right? Do you think that the Parliament of India can prescribe that you can pollute the air by using the age-old cars, age-old vehicles? You can cut the trees the way you want. Can they do so? But they have to take the policy that has evolved over a period of time in the international arena, and it is the global policy making, and India becomes only a state to implement the global policy making in relation to environmental issues, including the climate change. Similarly, we may have the fundamental rights part in the constitution, but when we speak about human rights, I think the policy that we draft, we take lot more from the international instruments rather than only from the constitutional provisions under part 3 of the constitution. And I need not tell you anything, because if you look at one article, Article 21 of the constitution, I think all the human rights values that the international instruments have been telling, they are all reflected in some form or the other in the judicial decisions, enriching the content of Article 21 of the constitution. Therefore, I would rather say Indian constitution is not even federal anymore in that sense. Why? In a globalized world, India is only a small unit trying to implement the global policies from time to time. And I don't want to get into the third aspect, third example of trade and commerce, right? And today, no state in the world is worth saying that they are self-independent, they are totally independent. Every state is interdependent. And therefore, to claim that one is a sovereign, supreme, right, all these nomenclatures have been diluted over a period of time. And the vision given by Dr. Ambedkar, if you look at through the glasses to the prism of globalization, I think even the policy making at the highest level is what we borrow from the globalized policy making, and India becomes simply a state to implement the policy rather than framing the policy, because the policy is already framed, but it gives certain framing of the laws to implement those policies and implement it, right? You also made something which we are talking about, constitutional morality, right? Uh, Dr. Ambedkar acknowledged the dual polity and articulated a caveat. Constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment. It has to be cultivated. It has to be cultivated by what? Not by the constitution, but by those individuals who are administering the constitution, the three branches of the government, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. It is not the judiciary saying it is constitutional morality. it is applicable to the other two branches as well. Then only it is possible, it has to be cultivated. We must realize that our people have yet to learn it, right? What is constitutional morality? They have not learnt it. And whatever these three branches give, possibly they will follow it, right? And therefore, he went on to say, we have to learn it. Democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil, right? Which is essentially undemocratic. What a beautiful statement of Dr. Ambedkar about the democracy, right? I once again reiterate and uh, present it before you. Democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil, which is essentially undemocratic. Because with divisive forces in this country that we have, right? We are yet to realize the goals of these democratic values, right? He said in the drafting constitution embodied and undoubtedly a federal constitution in as much as it sought to establish a dual polity consisting of the union at the center and the states at its periphery, right? Then issues came, which we also discussed, and I also made a mention about SR Bommai's case, Article 356. Many writers, I won't say anybody, if at all you want to understand the niceties of the Constitution and the values of the Constitution, the critical thinking is not available in the text today, right? Whether you take MP Jain or you take anybody else, Sirvai up to 1988, whatever it is, they don't reflect this. One book which I came across, which is very, very important for us, which opened up my thinking as well to a large extent, was a book written by Justice A.M. Bhattacharjee, right? Who delivered the first Setalwad lecture in the Bombay University and published by the Bombay University as a critical study of the Indian Constitution. And if somebody reads even today in 2021, they can see the dilemmas. I'm not saying that everything that is stated in that book is absolute, but that makes us think, not simply follow what the book writers say that we have parliamentary system or we have a unitary constitution, so on and so forth. Now, let me just take two articles in to support the views of Dr. Ambedkar. One is Article 356 and the other one is Article 355. I should have spoken about 355 first, but let me take Article 356. By and large, every student of law is familiar with this. And every politician is also equally familiar with this because it supports their either livelihood or out of power. So therefore, with reference to Article 356, many people write, it is because of this Indian Constitution is unitary in nature. Why? The parliament, the central government has absolute power to dissolve the state legislatures the way that they want, right? And on that, on Article 356, the draft provision, I do not want to quote the simultaneous provision, which will create some amount of confusion. And many members said that it is going to create confusion. And in response to those observations made in the Constituent Assembly, Dr. Ambedkar observed, I just quote, I share the sentiments that such articles will never be called into operation and that they remain a dead letter, right? And unfortunately, his observations have been made dead letter. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say, right? What he said was, I share the sentiments that the fear that the people had, the members of the Constituent Assembly had, that Article 356 will give dominance of the center over the states and it is likely to be misused. And then he states that I share the sentiments that such articles will never be called into operation and that they remain a dead letter, right? And after that he said, if at all they are brought into operation, if at all, it will remain as dead letter, but if at all it is brought into operation, I hope the president, who is endowed with these powers, will take proper precaution before actually suspending the administration of the province. I hope the first thing the president will do would be to issue a mere warning to a province that has heard that things were not happening in the way that they were intended to happen in the constitution. After giving that warning, if it fails, the second thing for him to do will be to order an election allowing the people of the province to settle matters by themselves. It is only when these two remedies fail that he should resort to this article. Right? And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the word of wisdom, the caution expressed by Dr. Ambedkar in the misuse of Article 356, which made lot many writers to say that Indian Constitution is more unitary than federal, right? They must read this article, read this debate over and over again to understand and appreciate. If at all we have to support, and I think the political practices were different, right? We can't blame anyone for that. We cannot blame the constitutional provisions. The observations made by Dr. Ambedkar in assuring the members of the Constituent Assembly were more than crystal clear. If people would like to read in between lines and dilute it, he is not responsible, nor the existing provisions of the Constitution are responsible. Then he says in justification, this is the beauty of Dr. Ambedkar, right? The language he had. I request all my students, please read the text of the Indian Constitution at least once in your lifetime. Make it a habit to read the provisions, right, carefully. I'm only asking you to read. Whether we'll understand everything is beyond our comprehension, right? And that is why I told you I've been a student of constitutional law for over 40 years. If you say whether I have understood everything, I would rather say sorry, right? Because every time you read, you get new ideas, new meanings, new interpretations, because things are changing. Our understanding also changes. And therefore, when Dr. Ambedkar made a mention, right, he made, to assuage the feelings of the members of the Constituent Assembly, I may say that I do not altogether deny that there is a possibility of this article being abused or applied for political purposes. Right? He was also aware of the fact that it is likely to be misused. But that argument, that objection, applies to every part of the Constitution which gives power to the center to override the provinces. If one article is likely to be misused, then there is a possibility of misuse of each and every article of the Constitution. And more particularly where the center is given the power to override the states. Right? In fact, I share the sentiments expressed yesterday, that was in the debates that is mentioned, that the proper thing we ought to expect is that such article will never be called into operation and they would remain a dead letter. What a beautiful language, right? I share your feelings, I share your sentiments. It is likely to be misused, but still, it will remain as a dead letter. It will remain as a dead letter is something. The dead letter today, if I have to tell you I don't even, I stopped counting the number of times Article 356 has been invoked, right? I wrote an article published in the Indian Law Institute in, when we were celebrating in the year 2000, yes, right? And I made a mention about it. Sarkaria Commission made a reference to it. They referred to 75 dissolutions. And then 76, 77, every time, like a cricket score. It was very interesting for us. But when the frequency increased, you also, everyone is hitting sixer. What will you do? Right? And therefore, I stopped counting. But I hope that there are more than 123 times that Article 356 has been invoked by the center. All other reasons not accepted, but only political reasons. Right? If you ask me the justification, I would rather say, except in 2 or 3 occasions, there was no justification for them to make the state governments dismiss and then impose their rule over them. Right? That was not what was intended in this Indian Federation, but this has been the practice. Now let me come to Article 355. I reversed it. I should have gone to 355 first. I reversed that order because I need to drive home a point. The point is, I don't know how many of us read this article very carefully. It is a duty imposed on the union. Right? It is 355 is a duty imposed on the union. Right? If people think that it is only a pious declaration made under Article 355, in defense of which Dr. Ambedkar observed, I think it is agreed that our constitution, notwithstanding the many provisions which are contained in it, whereby the center has been given powers to override the provinces, nonetheless is a federal constitution. And when we say the constitution is a federal constitution, it means this, that the provinces are as sovereign in their field which is left to them by the constitution, as the center is in the field which is assigned to it. In other words, barring the provisions which permit the center to override any legislation that may be passed by the provinces have
Yes, ma'am. Voice is not audible. Ma'am, voice is not audible. Please unmute.
Yeah, somebody has unmuted me. Right. Right. It is a plenary authority. Let me just repeat that last point. The provinces have a plenary authority. I don't have to define what plenary means. Authority to make any law for peace, order, and good governance of that province. Right? Who has the plenary power? It is only the province which has the plenary power. And it is peace, order, and good government. Where did Dr. Ambedkar get this phrase? Right? It is popularly called as POG, P-O-G-G. Right? And that is peace, order, and good government. And this, he had possibly taken it from the Canadian Constitution. Right? Where that three important, peace, order, and good government, are the primary responsibility of the province, none else. And if it is the primary responsibility of that province, how can the center override it? How can they administer the province sitting in Delhi? Right? So if that provinces are given a sovereign and given them the plenary power for this POG, P-O-G-G, right? Really speaking, the intervention of the center or any other authority must be deemed to be barred. This is not what I am saying. This is what Dr. Ambedkar said, right, almost 70 years ago, right? Speaking, the intervention of the center or any other authority must be deemed to be barred because that would be an invasion of the sovereign authority of the province. That is a fundamental proposition which I think we must accept by reason of the fact that we have a federal constitution. That being so, if the center is to interfere with the administration of the provincial affairs, as we may propose to authorize the center by virtue of this article, it must be by and under some obligation which the constitution imposes upon the center. The invasion must not be an invasion which is wanton, arbitrary, and unauthorized by law. Right? And if you carefully read Article 355, it imposes a duty on the center to defend the territory of every province, every state, right? And also ensure the proper administration is done. That's all, nothing more than that. It is a duty, right? And therefore, Ambedkar was very frank in his last comment on the article dealing with the emergency power, which once again reiterated that such an invasion by the Union shall not be wanton, arbitrary, and unauthorized by law. If you just use this language and test the constitutional validity of the use or misuse of Article 356, you will have the answer. We don't need a court to say this, right? As students of law, we can easily read and understand. I think I have taken sufficient time on the federal issues. I will move on to the second issue. And second issue is something very, very important. It is about fundamental rights, right? I need to flag certain issues. When the Americans, right, who wanted liberty, freedom, freedom of speech, everything, they spoke of very many things immediately after the American War of Independence in 1776. They took 13 years to draft the precise constitution consisting only of 7 articles, right? And they adopted the constitution on 4th July 1989, I'm sorry, 1789. And they realized immediately after adoption, it was ratified by the 13th state, they realized their mistake, or rather they realized their blunder, that whatever they were speaking of, freedom, liberty, property, speech, nothing was reflected in the constitution. So whatever they wanted to defend the rights of the people, that was missing. And immediately they constituted what you call it as a committee to look into. And in Williamsburg, Virginia, they spent roughly around a few months to charter 12 different amendments to the Constitution, which was adopted only in 1789. And within 2 years, out of 12 proposals made, 10 amendments were accepted and ratified by the states, and that is called as Bill of Rights in the American context, right? Whereas under the Indian Constitution, it becomes an essential part of the Constitution, Part 3, right from day number 1. And that is a beauty. It is also in the second level, the American Constitution very clearly says even if the rights are violated, they can approach the Supreme Court only on second appeal, which means they have to necessarily go to the circuit court first, and on appeal, some other lower court, and then first appeal to the circuit court, and then on second appeal go to the Supreme Court. But Indian Constitution drastically is different from that context. And that is the beauty. And when Dr. Ambedkar was asked after the adoption of the Constitution, they asked the question, what provision, which is the most important part of the Indian Constitution? Without any hesitation, he said Part 3 of the Constitution. And then again they asked, within Part 3, which right do you think is most important? Then he said, Article 32 of the Constitution, which gives that Indian citizen, right, or Indian resident, maybe an alien, to knock the doors of justice at the Supreme Court directly without going through ordinary courts and on appeal to the High Court and subsequent appeal to the Supreme Court. So the choice given to the individuals to move the Supreme Court directly is what makes Part 3 fundamental rights. Human rights are involved in that, no doubt about it. And that's the issue. If it is human rights are through statutes, for the violation of the statute, you can go to the High Court, not to the Supreme Court directly, right? But for the violation of the fundamental rights, you can directly go to the Supreme Court, and that is what is more important, right? And then couple of, he was a very jovial person as well, right? Many people look at him, with spectacles, with the books, with a, the very stiff face. Many people thought he was very, introvert or very inward looking. But let me tell you, he was such a jovial person. I would like to narrate a couple of them, right? And then when they were discussing about Article 22, right, and particularly 3 to 7, which also made this advisory board mandatory for this individual to be detained by the center or the states under the preventive detention law. Sri Mahavir Tyagi, who was a member of the Constituent Assembly, was questioning Dr. Ambedkar. And he asked this question, will you help a layman to understand as to why you have not provided for the revision by the advisory board of the cases under clause 4 the present clause 4 of Article 22. Dr. Ambedkar replied, in a beautiful way. I cannot explain to him the legal points in this house. This house is not a law class. Right? What he said was, this house is not a law class. And I cannot indulge in that kind of explanation now. The honorable member is my friend, but still, he did not snub him. He said, the honorable member is my friend. If he does not understand, he can come and ask me afterwards. Right? So how, you have to navigate with the 299 members on board. If every member starts questioning, one should not lose the patience. But he was very crystal clear, very jovial. And on some other occasion, right, with reference to the same article again, and I'm sorry, it is about Article 15, right? Sri Mahavir Tyagi made a comment saying that Dr. Ambedkar is a lawyer, for which Dr. Ambedkar replied very quickly, that is in a court of law, not here. When the member said that you are a lawyer, you speak like a lawyer, he said, yes, I am a lawyer, that is in a court, not here in the Constituent Assembly. And which the President of the Constituent Assembly also certified, yes, here he is not a lawyer, he is only chairman of the drafting committee. And again, Sri Mahavir Tyagi said, I want to know whether the detenues under clause 4 of Article 22, present Article 22, according to the law made by the Parliament or by the provinces, will have the benefit of their case being reviewed by the tribunal. Sir, I want to know whether the detenues who will be detained under the Act, which Parliament will enact under clause 4, will have the privilege of their case being reviewed by the tribunal proposed. This was a question he asked Dr. Ambedkar. To which Ambedkar replied, my friend Mr. Tyagi is acting as though he is overwhelmed by the fear that lie in himself that he is going to be a détenu. Right? He is likely to be a détenu himself. I do not see any prospect of that. Right? That is what Dr. Ambedkar said. For which Mahavir Tyagi replied and said, no, I am trying to safeguard your position. So you can see that how jovially, but they never lost the substance. But they were jovial enough in their interaction, but they hung on to their viewpoints, and ultimately they all contributed immensely to the wonderful framework of the Indian Constitution. Now, I will not get into the details of part 3. Thanks to the Supreme Court, thanks to the international conventions, thanks to what you call it as the process of globalization, and thanks to what you call it as the Millennium Development Goals and today's Sustainable Development Goals, many of the rights are added to the list of fundamental rights via Article 21 of the Constitution, and there lies the contribution, immense contribution made by the Supreme Court, and that too from 1978 onwards, particularly after Maneka Gandhi versus Union of India judgment delivered by the Supreme Court. I think there was not looking back by the court. Every day they have been strengthening what you call it as the core values of fundamental rights. I will not get into the details anymore. The third area I would like to mention is about the form of government. Right? And in my initial observations, I made a mention what type of government we should have. Right? Many people, without any question, if I ask this question to the audience, in each and every class I go, I ask them what type of government we have. Unanimous views expressed by them is that we have parliamentary form of government. And then I ask the question, when did we adopt this? Do we have a legal proof, evidence? Because I want evidence to understand that we have parliamentary form of government, and I give them sufficient time to go back, do research and come back, and they do, and even after so many years they don't come back to me, right? Because they don't get any evidence of any proof saying that we adopted the parliamentary form of government, right? And that is why I would like to start with this observation that many of the Indians, I'm using the term many, not majority, because not even 1% of the Indian population of 1.4 crores, right? Not even 1% belong to the legal fraternity as law students, researchers, teachers, lawyers, judges. If you take all of them, even then it will not cross 1 million, 1% of the population. So these 1% of the Indians believe, or maybe somebody who is educated or who are in politics, possibly believe the parliamentary form of government was the unanimous choice of the Constituent Assembly. But if you carefully read, right, the facts prove otherwise, right? The leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, Dr. Ambedkar and Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, they were not on the same page with reference to the form of government. And that is why there is no mention about the form of government. I just want the teachers as well as the senior students, the LLM students to understand, please carefully read Article 53. The executive power of the union shall be vested in the president. The language used here is power, the executive power. Whereas in Article 74, the president is made to be bound by the advice of the Council of Ministers headed by the Prime Minister in the discharge of his functions, right? So they used two different words, powers in Article 53, functions in Article 74, right? And nowhere the government is defined. This is another beauty of the Indian Constitution. The government is not defined. And therefore, the shortcut method that the writers, including the Western writers, right, Ivor Jennings or anybody else, or Alexander Wicks, who was the dean, the head of the Department of Faculty of Law of the Madras University, who was an advisor to Nehru, they never believed it. They always used interchangeably Article 75 with government. Article 75 says the Council of Ministers. There shall be a Council of Ministers headed by the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister be appointed by the President. Other ministers appointed on the advice of the Prime Minister by the President. They hold office during the pleasure of the President and all these things. It speaks about only the Council of Ministers, not the government. And therefore, whatever those Western writers said in the initial stages, we simply followed it without questioning it. And in the classroom, if somebody questions, we don't have the answer. So therefore, we silence the students. Oh, sit down. Don't ask. Don't behave like as if you know everything, right? We silence them. Nor we are willing to understand, nor we are willing to educate, nor we are willing to clarify to the students what form of government we have. And therefore, the three leaders were not on the same page, right? And therefore, the choice of the parliamentary system was one political party's decision. It is not the decision of the Constituent Assembly at any point of time. But they brought it down through some other means. And what is it? The Congress had formed an expert committee under the chairmanship of Nehru in the preparation of the Constituent Assembly. And in its meeting on 15th August, the small panel decided that independent India would have a British type government. This is party's, observation. But that was not reflected in the Constituent Assembly debates at all. At the time, neither Ambedkar nor Patel was in favor of a strictly parliamentary system. For that matter, neither was Mahatma Gandhi nor Pakistan's founder and All India Muslim League leader Muhammad Ali Jinnah, although they were not involved in the framing of our constitution. Right? Jinnah was also initially, he was there before going to Pakistan, right? And Gandhi was never in the constitution making, but both of them very clearly observed, no, we don't want this parliamentary system, right? And Jinnah had already observed in 1939, right? See the beauty, not that we have to say that he is a Pakistani, we should not bother about it. He was an Indian when the observation was made in 1939. He said, in his irrevocable opposition to the parliamentary system, right? And similarly, Gandhi also said, right? And see the observation of Gandhi. If India copies England, if India copies England, it is my firm conviction, it is my firm conviction that she will be ruined. What else you want? What else you want? Right? We simply quote the Supreme Court's judgment, left, right, and the center without application of mind. And when we read, at least this is an occasion for us to go back, read and come back and question the authority of the parliament, or question the authority of the legislature, or question the authority of the prime minister or the chief minister, right? And therefore, this was the firm belief of Mahatma Gandhi. We only made him a hero, right? After his death, we only made him, the father of the nation, right? I think we all enjoy calling him as the father of the nation. And we also enjoyed when people addressed Nehru as the Chacha Nehru, right? We are all believing him because our culture is like that. But in reality, he was observation, if India copies England, it is my firm conviction, not ordinary conviction, firm conviction that she would be ruined, right? So when the Constituent Assembly debates began, right, in 1946, the Congress Expert Committee decision became the recommendation of the Union Constitution Committee headed by Nehru. There were 2 points of disagreement, whether India should be unitary or federal, and the second one is whether we should have presidential or parliamentary form of government. Nehru's committee wanted a typical parliamentary structure of a unitary state with an indirectly elected executive. With an indirectly elected executive. And Dr. Ambedkar was too good, right? And his views on the form of government that India should have, including his fervent opposition to parliamentary type of executive, were well known even before he joined the assembly. Way back in 1945, he said, majority rule, the fundamental basis of parliamentary government, is untenable in theory, and unjustifiable in practice. Untenable in theory, unjustifiable in practice. Why? Because of the majority rule, right? And now to make the majority, you have the games the politicians play, then you have the constitution being amended, anti-defection law. I think nothing could stop them, right? Their intention is majority rule, right? This is what he said. Now, in 1947, when these discussions were taken, after the Pakistan was created, the Congress held 70% of the seats. Congress held 70% of the seats. As Ambedkar noted on this, the Congress holds this house in its possession. see, the Congress holds this house in its possession. This was in the Constituent Assembly debates on 17th December 1946, right? And finally, what they approved was that the president will be indirectly elected, not directly elected. And once you say that he is indirectly elected, then becomes the party politics. The party sponsors one candidate, and then the individuals elected, they become thankful for becoming the president of India, the first citizen of the country, and 5 years they spend, right, as what you call it as the mouthpiece of the party in power, rather than saying anything that is important, right? These are the things that we need to understand. Not that we have anything against the office of the president, but if it is indirectly elected, today you can see, right, Babu Rajendra Prasad, right, when he was the first president elected, was also a congressman. And when the tussle emerged between him and Nehru, he contested the election for the second time in 1957, which Nehru didn't allow, right? But he contested and won the election, right? And then in 62, I don't know how many of you know, Rajendra Prasad wanted to contest the election one more time. Nehru had to use all his connections in finally convincing Babu Rajendra Prasad to withdraw his nomination. Right? Jovially, many people say this. You also have to collect some data on this. The Indian Law Institute, for which they just say that is opposite the Supreme Court. The foundation stone was to be laid by the president. President Rajendra Prasad laid the foundation stone and mentioned that this Indian Law Institute must take up research work on the powers of the president. Right, and left. In the evening, they invited Nehru to address them. And while addressing the audience, Nehru said, if you undertake that response, the building will remain in the cornerstone. Only the base will be there. Nothing will come out of this. Right? They had to choose between the foundation stone and the building. And they chose the right one, and now we have a building. So you can understand in whatever manner that without even making a mention about the form of government, we have simply followed the British parliamentary system minus their culture, their honesty, sincerity, dedication, and commitment to the people and commitment to the government, which we seldom see in governance. And therefore, that culture, you can transpose one provision of the constitution to another, but it is very, very difficult to copy the constitution, right? Having said this, I will not get into the details of this parliamentary presidential discussion. And today there are many takers, even in 1977, right? Many members in the parliament also wanted the presidential form of government, but something dubious. They wanted possibly Prime Minister Nehru to become the president and then run the proceedings. That was a different purpose. The third aspect, which very briefly I will take up, is election commission. Something very, very important, and I can go on for about 6 to 8 hours to discuss about this. Now I don't have that luxury of time, but I would only mention that the views expressed by Dr. Ambedkar, right, in incorporating Article 324 is undoubtedly a radical change. This article in the present form proposes to centralize the election machinery in the hands of a single commission to be provided by regional commissioners not working under the provincial government, but working under the superintendence and control of the Central Election Commission. This undoubtedly is a radical change from the earlier draft, right? They never wanted the Election Commission to be subservient to the government in power. They wanted to give that independence, right? And Dr. Ambedkar was very firm that the Chief Election Commissioner should be insulated from the grip of the executive of the day. During the speech on this article, right, Constituent Assembly Debates, Volume 8, page number 905 to 907, Dr. Ambedkar observed like this: we have made provisions to ensure that the Chief Election Commissioner shall not be liable to be removed except in the manner as a judge of the Supreme Court through an impeachment by Parliament, if the object of this House, that is Assembly, is that all matters relating to elections should be outside the control of the executive government of the day. Please see, this is the crux of it, right? I once again reiterate the observation made by Dr. Ambedkar. All matters relating to elections should be outside the control of the executive government of the day. It is absolutely necessary that the new machinery which we are setting up, namely the Election Commission, should be irremovable by the executive by a mere fiat. We have therefore given the Election Commissioner, the Chief Election Commissioner, the same status as far as removability is concerned as we have given the Judge of the Supreme Court. Regarding other matters of the Election Commission, we have left the matter to the President, subject to one important condition, that the Chief Election Commissioner must recommend that the removal is just and proper of other election commissioners. I think if you read, my sincere feeling and opinion is that the judgment delivered by the Supreme Court on the powers of the Election Commission particularly on TN Sessions case, right? And accepting the law made by the Parliament as valid. All these things are contrary to the provisions of Article 324. That's my humble opinion. I'm not saying that you must do something contrary to it, but I will be too happy to interact with you on some other occasion on the Election Commission and the problems and perspectives that we have to face today. The fourth aspect that I would like to mention in only one sentence was that Dr. Ambedkar very clearly pointed out that it is the education which is the right weapon to cut the social slavery, and it is the education which will enlighten the downtrodden masses to come up and gain social status, economic betterment, and political freedom. And if you recollect the words of Article 45 as it stood then, right? As a student of law, I have been observing this free and compulsory education for all children. It is not minority children, majority children, children belonging to caste, this nothing. Free and compulsory education for all children up to the age of 14, and that is to be
Voice missing, ma'am. Voice is missing.
okay. Okay, I think it's again back. Okay, wonderful. So therefore, if this was made possible by each and every government, central and more necessarily the provincial governments, within 10 years, I think India would have been one among the forward-looking countries in the world, right? But we regret, now we are tom-tomming ourselves. The Supreme Court said education is a fundamental right. And then the Parliament enacted and then amended the Constitution, making 21A as a fundamental right. What use is it? Right? We have lost the core value in the first 10 years, and therefore the individuals could gain the social status, economic betterment, and political freedom. Right? And the next area that I would like to mention is something relating to the fundamental rights and directive principles. I will not get into the details of that. I think wonderful statements of Ambedkar. I'll read only one aspect. If it is said that the directive principles have no legal force, I am prepared to admit that they have no sort of binding force at all. Nor am I prepared to concede that they are useless because they have no binding force in law. Who should be in power is left to be determined by the people. But whosoever captures the power will not be free to do what he likes with it. In the exercise of it, he will have to respect these instruments of instructions called directive principles. He may not have to answer for their breach in a court of law, but he will certainly have to answer for them before the electorate at election time. I think that is a beautiful phrase coming from Dr. Ambedkar in defense of directive principles. But I think we are too happy to talk about the Supreme Court decisions, how to balance and the constitutional amendments, so on and so forth. But I think we forget that it is a duty cast on the states, right, to translate these directive principles into pieces of legislation. The next one is about reservation. I will just say only one aspect, which is a controversial topic to discuss. But at the same time, I'll be failing in my duty if I don't mention what Ambedkar said, that the drafting committee of the Constitution has to produce a formula that reconciled 3 points of view, right, when it came to government jobs. And this is what he said. Number one, there should be equality of opportunity for all citizens. That's number one. There shall be equality of opportunity for all citizens. Second, there should be no reservation of any sort for any class or community at all. And number three, there should be reservation for certain communities which have so far been outside the administration. Three different points. And then he argued that if reservations were too excessive, the first principle of equality of opportunity would be violated. The first principle of equality of opportunity will be violated. To illustrate his point, Ambedkar said that if a government reserved 70% of the positions in government jobs, leaving only 30% for the general populace, then this would violate the principle that there shall be equality of opportunity. Right? And today we are very happy in expanding, I think I will not discuss, this is the policy of politics, and let us not become politicians on this occasion. Right. I think I have taken these aspects to the extent that is possible. I would like to wind up by saying a few observations of Dr. Ambedkar. In his speech, one day before the adoption of the Constitution on 26th. So the speech was delivered by him on 25th November 1949. In his speech, Ambedkar has cautioned that the working of a constitution does not depend on the document itself. Does not depend upon the document itself. Ultimately, its effect depends on those tasked with the implementing it. However good a constitution may be, it is sure to turn out bad because those who are called to work it happen to be a bad lot. However bad a constitution may be, it may turn out to be a good if who are called to work it happens to be a good lot. Right? These are the words of Dr. Ambedkar. The Constitution can provide only the organs of the state, such as the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The factors on which the working of these organs of the state depends are the people and the political parties they will set up as their instruments to carry out their wishes and their politics. This is one important observation that we need to accept. The second one is, I will not get into that. That is about creed over nation. I will not speak about that. About the Satyagraha revolution. It is a very, very interesting observation made by Dr. Ambedkar. According to him, I'm sorry, I will just quote his observation. I will not mince words. If we wish to maintain democracy, not merely in form, but also in fact. See the language. Not merely in form, but also in fact, what must we do? The first thing, in my judgment, we must do is to hold fast to constitutional methods of achieving our social and economic objectives. So you have to keep constitutional objectives. It means we must abandon the bloody methods of revolution. It means that we must abandon the method of civil disobedience, non-cooperation, and satyagraha. These are all the tools employed by Mahatma Gandhi. And now he says, don't do it. When there was no way left for constitutional methods for achieving economic and social objectives, there was a great deal of justification for unconstitutional methods. But where constitutional methods are open, there can be no justification for these unconstitutional methods. These methods are nothing but the grammar of anarchy, and the sooner they are abandoned, the better for us. But we celebrate the Supreme Court judgment that you have a right to strike, but not disturb the rights of others. after 40 years of the commencement of the Constitution. We have totally missed the opportunity of appreciating, understanding, and internalizing the values propounded by Dr. Ambedkar. And finally, not finally, I will stop. I have got too many things, but I will just take two important points because I'm tempted to make a mention about something which is very, very touching, very, very important for us. About hero worship in politics, or the cult that he called it as Bhakti movement in politics. His observations are just mind-boggling. There is nothing wrong in being grateful to great men who have rendered lifelong services to the country. But there are limits to gratefulness. As has been well said by Irish patriot Daniel O'Connell, no man can be grateful at the cost of his honor. Right? He was citing Daniel O'Connell and saying no man can be grateful at the cost of his honor, no woman can be grateful at the cost of her chastity, and no nation can be grateful at the cost of its liberty. This caution is far more necessary in the case of India than in the case of any other country. For India, bhakti, or what may be called the path of devotion or hero worship, plays a part in its politics unequaled in magnitude by the part it plays in politics of any other country in the world. Bhakti in religion may be a road to the salvation of the soul, but in politics, bhakti or hero worship is a sure road to degradation and eventual dictatorship. Are we listening? Right? And if you are listening, are we able to understand what he meant? And if we understand what he meant, are we able to inculcate the same values in the minds of youngsters, right? So that we can change the way the politics looks at today. And finally, before I wind up, about social democracy, right? Dr. Ambedkar ultimately emphasizes that people must not be content with a mere political democracy, but strive for social democracy. Not simply political, but social democracy with underlying principles of equality, liberty, and fraternity. We are now, after 70 years, we keep on dividing the caste, the communities with the prefixes most backward, more backward, backward, so on and so forth, right? But we have to keep this social democracy with underlying principles of equality, liberty, and fraternity. And the more we divide, fraternity becomes the first victim. And fraternity is one among the important phrases used in the preamble of the Constitution as well. And he went on to say, political democracy cannot last unless there lies at the base of social democracy. What does social democracy mean? He also defines it. It means a way of life which recognizes liberty, equality, and fraternity as the principles of life. They form a union of Trinity. What is that? Liberty, equality, and fraternity. They form the union of Trinity in the sense that to divorce one from the other is to defeat the very purpose of democracy. To divorce one from the other two, right, is to defeat the very purpose of democracy. And he mentions, I want all of you to carefully listen to these three statements. Without equality, liberty would produce the supremacy of few over the many. Second, without fraternity, liberty would produce the supremacy of few over the many. And finally, the third one, without fraternity, liberty and equality could not become a natural course of things. It would require a constable to enforce them. It would require a constable to enforce them. I think I can keep on. I have got 3 sets of papers and I have not even completed the first set. And I think I'll be violating your human rights if I continue for long. I would like to appreciate and thank the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Bhimrao Dr. Ambedkar Law University, Jaipur, Dr. Dev Swarup, for extending an invitation requesting me to address the faculty and the staff, the students on this occasion when we remember this glorious son of India. And let us try to translate some of the values into practice in whatever little we do in the years to come. And I thank all the principals, the faculty members, Dr. Mridul Srivastav, and others for, and also my colleague Dr. Tapan, who is also there on line with us, for a wonderful patient hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. If you permit, may I ask the students if they want to clarify or ask something, because the lecture was really thought-provoking, very analytical, and excellent talk, sir. So if any student is interested in asking anything or anybody is interested, can I request you if you have few minutes to say something more?
I have all the time.
So may I request anybody who is interested in asking something? So please, you can ask.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, may I ask?
Yes, Diksha, please. Diksha ko unmute video.
Hello.
Yes, Diksha.
Yes. So thank you so much for the lecture. It was very, and I got exposed to some of the features of the Constitution as the Constituent Assembly debates that I had not had the opportunity to know about and to think about. It was very thought provoking. I would definitely go back and do on these provisions. So my question to you is, sir, am I audible to you?
Yes,
Yes,
Diksha.
yes, yes.
Yes.
Go on. Yes, Diksha.
Diksha, come on. Diksha, we can't hear you.
I think she logged out.
Yeah, no, something is, I don't know, something went wrong, I think.
Okay, let her come back. In the meantime, anybody would like to?
Yeah, if
Sir,
any,
I'm back.
okay, come
Yes.
on, come
Yeah.
on.
There was some network issue. So, sir, my question is about judicial activism. Though we can see that the Supreme Court from a very long period of time has playing as a role of protection of the Constitution through judicial activism and countering the anarchist moves by the political government or the cabinet and the government. So, my question is about the disadvantages of judicial activism, as we can see that there is no check on the power of Supreme Court at times. So what if by exercising this power the Supreme Court goes all berserk? There is no one to check it out. So sir, what are your views on it? Because in the Keshwananda Bharti case there was a risk that was being taken basically with the constitution. If Supreme Court would not have enacted the basic structure doctrine, have gone the other way and we would have a different set of history altogether. So sir, what is your view as Supreme Court being the highest court in the country and no check on it when it violates the principle of separation of power?
Diksha, I hope you are a student at the university.
Yes, sir. She is the student of LLM part, one year.
Very good, very good. Diksha, I think it's a wonderful question. Again, the topic, the issue that you have raised, I can go on for about 6 hours to explain why things have gone the way that it has gone so far. Let me put it in one sentence because I should give the opportunity to others also to interact. The Supreme Court, by and large, I told you I respected the Supreme Court as far as the strengthening of the fundamental rights chapter. With reference to other areas, interpretation, so on and so forth, they have done reasonably good job. And in many places, they also failed. But it is you and me, students like you, students like me, when we don't put it across and tell the court in our writings that the Supreme Court is wrong, not that you have to say that you are wrong, not in that language, but you have to say why the judgment delivered by the Supreme Court is wrong by giving proper reasons, right? And when I say proper reasons, you should also understand that it requires lots of courage, lots of conviction, lots of reading, and telling the court where they have gone wrong by saying that this is a place where the Supreme Court has gone overboard. And let me tell you, that type of quality publication we don't have today, even after 70 years. I need to tell you that the Harvard Law School students, they publish a journal, law journal. The first ones rather to read the journal, not the lawyers, not the law students, not the teachers, but the 9 judges of the Supreme Court. Right? Why? Because that is a place where the students and the faculty apply their mind, dissect the judgment delivered by the Supreme Court, saying whether they are moving, whether they are right or wrong, whether they are moving in the right direction at all or not, very politely. And it gives an immense opportunity for the judges. If the reasoning given by these articles are better, they try to correct themselves, and in the subsequent judgments, because they stay for long, unlike the Indian Supreme Court judges, they stay for long till their death. So therefore, they are able to change their views and change the law as well, the judgment as well. That benefit we don't have, right? For which you and I are responsible. Number 2, for whatever is the reason, we have not read the Constitution. Forget about reading the Constituent Assembly debates. We don't even read the constitutional text. How many of you, as LLM students, carry the text of the Constitution to the classroom and ask the question to the teachers? The text says this, the judgment says this. Who is right? Which one I should trust? We don't ask. Therefore, the concept of separation of powers is not taking place in this country. And if at all it is taking place, it is only with reference to the protection of the status of the court and the government in power, rather than the real concept of separation of powers embedded in not one, but series of articles under the Indian Constitution. And therefore, Lord Acton's statement, oft quoted popular statement, comes to my mind. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Whether it is the executive, whether it is legislative, or whether it is judicial branch, when they try to become absolute, and I think it is liberty, what Montesquieu said, if 2 powers are mingled together, the victim is the liberty. There begins the end of liberty. So therefore, I can keep on giving more and more examples, but I stop with these 2. One, we are the reason, and number 2, the court is yet to define its own limits, where it can step in and where it should not, right? And similarly, the legislature, where it should have done. Let me tell you, if the Parliament of India has used the power of removal of the first one, Justice Ramasamy, from office, things would have been entirely different in the judicial branch as well, right? And Soumitra Sen, he was also allowed to escape. It is a failure of one branch of the government over the other, and therefore the concept of checks and balances are not functional. It is academic input that can oil the machine called separation of powers and keep them going. All of them are created under the Constitution. No one is supreme over the other 2, right? Therefore, let the Constitution be supreme and make these 3 branches to work within the limited limitations provided under the Constitution. Then I think things will work. Thank you very much for that wonderful question.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Anybody else, please? So thank you, sir, for sharing about Dr. Bhim Rao Ambedkar, sir, how he became the chairman of the drafting committee, the first law minister, and finalized the draft of the constitution, and how Professor Ivory Jennings' system was changed, and first area, the concept of federation, you told us in a very nice manner, declared that constitution, Indian constitution is federal, which contained distribution of power between center and state. Then views of Ambedkar ji about Article 356, sentiments, his sentiments that such articles as Article 356 will never be come in operation and remain as a dead letter, and so on and so forth, about POG also, peace, order and good government, the fundamental rights, election commission, and so on. So thank you very much, sir, for everything. And now we have our registrar, sir, with us. Our registrar, Shri Raj Narayan Sharma ji, he is there in this platform, a man who has always guided us in difficult times and extended unending support in completion of our tasks. May I request you, sir, to please deliver formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. First of all, I would like to congratulate everyone participants for this auspicious day of Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar Jayanti. Sir, I am really grateful to V. Vijay Kumar sir and our Honorable Vice Chancellor sir, who make this talk held on this day, and this was really a eye opener and knowledgeable session for us. We all participants are benefited by your valuable talk, and I thank to all participants, Dr. M.S. Rajpurohit Sahab, Dr. Dinesh Shukla ji, Professor Tappan ji, Dr. Tarun Arora ji, all faculty members, Honorable Ma'am, and all our principals, participants, LLM students. Really, thanks to all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Your inputs will stay with us for long, and maybe request you for some another interaction with our students, LLM students. So we'll let you know whenever it is possible, and whenever you are free, we would like to invite you again, sir. Thank you so much for everything. Thank you, sir.
Welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you, sir. Namaskar.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Dr. Raj Purohit, nice to see you after a long time.
Sir, thank
Let
you.
us keep in touch.
Thank you, sir.
Right.
Thanks a lot, sir.
Of course, sir. It is always enlightening for us when you speak something, sir. It's always, sir.
He always speaks in depth, you know, yeah, analytical expressions are there.
An excellent session, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Saini.
Thank you, sir.
It was really enlightened. Very much.
Can I leave?
I am very much grateful and thankful
Thanks.
to Professor Vijay Kumar sir, who has given a very extraordinary lecture. Thank you, sir.
Sir, thanks to our BOM members who participated this talk. Thank you, Sani ji. SK Sani sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Gonaram bhi hai.
Bhagwan Ramji sir, yes, all honorable BOM members.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
सर अपना फोटो बाहर निकालोगे जब दिखेंगे ना आप.
Yes, sir.
Session, sir. Thank you.
Okay, sir.
हाँ, thank you.